What happens when a CEO goes undercover to expose the deep-rooted toxicity within her company? Can she confront the manager who's been discriminating against employees for years? Will the change she brings truly create a fair and equal workplace? Discover the intense journey of Evelyn Harper and her fight to reshape Sterling Enterprises. Don't miss the shocking twists and emotional moments. Watch now on H2 Black Thread. Like, comment, and subscribe to our channel for more amazing stories. Evelyn Harper had always been a woman of action. After years of climbing the corporate ladder, earning her stripes and proving herself in a tough industry, she had finally achieved her dream job as the CEO of Sterling Enterprises. It was a company with a long history, a powerhouse in its field, but Evelyn had a gut feeling that things weren't as perfect as they appeared on the outside. Her instincts told her that something wasn't quite right with the company's internal culture. And so, to truly understand the dynamics at play, she came up with a bold plan. She would go undercover. Evelyn had a lot riding on her new role. She wasn't just another CEO coming in to make the shareholders happy. She was determined to make a real difference. To do that, she knew she had to see things firsthand. She didn't want to just sit in her corner office and read the reports that everyone else sent her. She wanted to feel the atmosphere. She wanted to see how people interacted, how decisions were made, and most importantly, how employees treated each other. So, for the next few weeks, Evelyn would disguise herself as a low-level employee and work among the staff, blending in as just another face in the crowd. No one knew who she was, and that was the point. Her first day was nerve-wracking, to say the least. Evelyn had spent hours carefully selecting her outfit. She didn't want to stand out, but she also didn't want to look like someone who had just rolled out of bed. She went with a simple blouse, slacks, and minimal makeup, enough to fit in but not enough to draw any unnecessary attention. Just act like you belong, she reminded herself as she walked through the front doors of Sterling Enterprises for the very first time. She was about to step into the belly of the beast, and she needed to see what was going on behind closed doors. As soon as she walked into the building, her nerves kicked up a notch. The place was bustling with activity, people darting in and out of conference rooms, phones ringing, the buzz of constant chatter filling the air. It was the kind of corporate chaos Evelyn had been used to in the past, but there was something about this place that felt off. Evelyn made her way to the reception desk where she was greeted by a cheerful young woman. "Good morning, can I help you?" "Yes, I'm here to start in the operations department," Evelyn said, offering her most confident smile. The receptionist nodded and pointed her down the hallway. "You'll report to Margaret Reynolds. She's the department manager. She'll show you the ropes." As Evelyn walked down the corridor, she couldn't help but feel a little nervous. This was the moment where her undercover plan would begin. She wanted to make a good impression, but at the same time, she needed to keep her eyes wide open and her mouth shut. She couldn't afford to make a misstep, not yet. When Evelyn finally reached the operations department, she hesitated for a second before entering. The door swung open, and she was greeted by a tall, stern-looking woman with sharp features and an even sharper tone. This was Margaret Reynolds, the manager she'd been warned about. Margaret didn't look up when Evelyn entered the room. She was too busy sorting through papers on her desk, but she gave a quick wave, indicating that Evelyn should take a seat. "You're Evelyn, right?" Margaret said, finally looking up but not bothering to stand. Her gaze immediately flicked up and down Evelyn's outfit, sizing her up. "Yes, I'm Evelyn." "I'm here to assist wherever needed," Evelyn replied, trying to keep her tone friendly and confident. Margaret raised an eyebrow, clearly unimpressed. "I don't know what HR was thinking hiring someone like you for this department, but it's not like I have a choice." Her voice was sharp, laced with an almost palpable condescension. Evelyn bit back the instinct to correct her and instead just nodded. Margaret seemed to take her silence as a challenge. "Well, just so you know, the work here isn't easy. We've got a lot to do, and if you're not cut out for it, don't waste my time." She turned her back on Evelyn without waiting for a response. Evelyn's stomach churned as she tried to make sense of the cold reception she had just received. It wasn't the kind of greeting she'd expected, but Evelyn wasn't about to let it throw her off. She had a job to do, and nothing, not even Margaret Reynolds, was going to stand in her way. As the day went on, Evelyn kept her eyes open. She tried to blend in, doing small tasks, running errands, and observing how things operated around her. What she quickly realized was that the company culture was not as welcoming as it seemed. It wasn't just Margaret's dismissive attitude that was concerning. It was how the entire department seemed to function. Evelyn saw James Carter, a seasoned employee who had been with the company for over 25 years, constantly being given the worst assignments. She noticed how he was always given the grunt work while younger, less experienced employees were assigned the more prestigious, high-profile tasks. James never said a word about it. He simply did what was asked of him, even though it was clear he was being treated unfairly. But it wasn't just James. Isabella Ramirez, a receptionist from a Latina background, was frequently interrupted during meetings. Whenever she tried to speak, other employees would either talk over her or completely disregard her input. Evelyn could see the frustration on Isabella's face, but like James, she kept her head down and just carried on with the job. Evelyn could already tell what kind of toxic environment she had walked into. She had known that the company wasn't perfect, but this was something else. This was a culture of discrimination, where those from minority backgrounds were treated as second-class citizens. And what disturbed Evelyn the most was how everyone seemed to accept it. It was as if this kind of behavior had been normalized, like it was just a part of the job. She couldn't stand it. She had walked into Sterling Enterprises with the intention of observing the workplace dynamics, but now, as the hours ticked by, she found herself getting angrier. How could they let this go on? How could a company with so much potential let such a toxic culture thrive? By lunchtime, Evelyn had made up her mind. She had come here to understand the problems, and she was seeing them clearly now. She wasn't going to sit by and let this continue. Evelyn didn't know what the next step would be yet, but one thing was clear. She wasn't about to let this company stay like this. It was time to make a change, but for now, she would bide her time. Stay calm, stay focused. She had a plan and she would stick to it. But one thing was certain, this was just the beginning. Evelyn woke up early the next morning, her mind racing as she prepared for another day undercover. The events of her first day at Sterling Enterprises had left her disturbed, but there was still so much to observe. She couldn't afford to make any rash moves just yet. Her plan was to stay low, blend in, and gather as much information as possible. She needed to understand the full scope of the issue before she made her next move. The moment she walked through the doors of the office, she could feel the tension in the air. It was the same bustling atmosphere as before, but there was an undercurrent of discomfort, as if the employees were all walking on eggshells. There was something unsettling about the way they interacted with one another, something Evelyn couldn't quite put her finger on. But she was starting to get an idea. Her first stop of the day was the operations department, where she would once again report to Margaret Reynolds, the department manager. Evelyn's interactions with Margaret had been cold and dismissive the day before, and she didn't expect things to improve. But as she walked through the door, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was deeply wrong with the way Margaret ran her department. Margaret was at her desk, barking orders as usual. "Evelyn, I need these reports on my desk by the end of the day. No excuses." Margaret barely looked up from her computer, her tone sharp and commanding. Evelyn simply nodded and went to work on the task at hand. But as the day wore on, she started to pay closer attention to the dynamics in the department. It didn't take long for Evelyn to see the blatant discrimination that was happening under Margaret's watch. There was James Carter, a seasoned employee who had been with the company for over 2 decades. James was a black man, and his experience was second to none. Yet day after day, he was assigned the most menial tasks: filing paperwork, taking out the trash, organizing outdated inventory. Evelyn knew from her research that James had once been a rising star in the company, but now it seemed as though he was stuck in a perpetual cycle of busy work. Evelyn's heart sank as she watched James quietly accept his assignments. He was efficient, hardworking, and dedicated, but it was clear that his contributions weren't being valued. What disturbed Evelyn even more was the way Margaret treated him. She never once acknowledged his experience or offered him anything more substantial. She simply handed him one task after another, never once questioning whether he was capable of more. In stark contrast, the younger white employees were given high-profile projects, and many of them were rapidly climbing the corporate ladder. Evelyn couldn't help but notice Greg Taylor, a younger employee who had been with the company for only a year, getting promoted to a leadership position, while James remained stuck in the same low-level position despite his decades of service. She watched Greg as he casually strolled into the office around 9:15 a.m. A full 15 minutes after the workday had officially started. Margaret waved him off, barely glancing up from her desk as she said, "Just make sure you're on time tomorrow, all right?" It was a light reprimand at best, a stark contrast to the harsh scolding James had received the day before for being just a minute late. Isabella Ramirez, the Latina receptionist, was another example of how the company's leadership treated employees of color. Every time Isabella spoke up in a meeting, trying to contribute her ideas or offer suggestions, she was immediately interrupted by her colleagues. Margaret, of course, never stepped in to stop the behavior. It was as if Isabella's voice didn't matter. Evelyn had been quietly observing from the back of the room during one meeting when Isabella tried to offer a suggestion about improving the customer service process. As soon as she spoke, Jeffrey, a junior manager, cut her off mid-sentence. "I think we should let the men handle the important stuff," he said dismissively, turning to Margaret for approval. Margaret didn't say a word. She just nodded and continued the meeting, ignoring Isabella completely. Evelyn couldn't believe what she was witnessing. The favoritism and racial bias were so evident it was almost uncomfortable to watch. It wasn't just the way Margaret treated employees of color. It was how the entire company seemed to be structured around favoring a certain demographic. Those who looked like Margaret and the higher-ups were the ones who were promoted, praised, and given the best opportunities. Those who didn't fit that mold, they were pushed to the sidelines. After lunch, Evelyn had a conversation with Lena, a junior employee who had been with the company for only a few months. As they spoke, Lena mentioned that she had already been given the opportunity to manage a major project, while Isabella, who had been there for years, had never even been considered for a leadership role. Lena was white, and as she talked, Evelyn couldn't help but notice the uncomfortable shift in the tone of the conversation when she asked about how things worked in the office. Lena seemed eager to talk about her success, but as she spoke, Evelyn sensed that she wasn't entirely comfortable with the way the company functioned. It was almost as if Lena didn't want to acknowledge that the only reason she was given opportunities was because of her race. Evelyn felt a rising sense of anger. It was clear now. This was a company built on discrimination and racial bias, and it was thriving under Margaret's leadership. Employees like James and Isabella had been made to feel invisible, While employees like Greg were handed opportunities they didn't deserve simply because they were the right color, the right gender, the right fit for the company's toxic culture. Evelyn knew she couldn't stay silent. This wasn't just a minor issue. This was the core of the company's problems. The culture at Sterling Enterprises was rotten to the core, and it needed to be uprooted. The question was, how could she change it? She couldn't just walk in and start firing people. She had to be strategic. She had to be patient. But one thing was clear: this was not going to stand. She couldn't let James and Isabella, along with the other employees, continue to suffer under this toxic leadership. Evelyn made a silent vow to herself. Change was coming, and it would start with her. She wasn't just going to be the CEO who showed up at board meetings and signed off on reports. She was going to be the CEO who made real changes, the kind of changes that would ensure fairness for everyone. Margaret's days were numbered. Evelyn couldn't sleep that night. The events of the past 2 days were playing on a loop in her mind, each instance of discrimination, each subtle or not so subtle act of bias replaying in her head like a haunting refrain. James Carter, loyal and hardworking, yet stuck in the shadows of the company's toxic hierarchy. Isabella Ramirez, constantly silenced and ignored, her contributions dismissed as if they meant nothing. And then there was Greg Taylor, a white employee with barely any experience, being promoted while seasoned staff like James were left to waste away in the trenches of meaningless tasks. Evelyn had come to Sterling Enterprises hoping to uncover the truth about the culture here, and she had certainly done that. But now the truth was far worse than she had anticipated. It wasn't just isolated incidents. It wasn't just one bad manager. It was the entire culture rooted in racial bias, favoritism, and a complete lack of fairness. This wasn't just a company that needed a little tweaking. No, this was a company that needed a complete overhaul. She couldn't stay undercover any longer. She had seen enough. Evelyn knew what had to be done. The next morning, she walked into the office, her mind made up. Today would be the day she confronted Margaret Reynolds. The woman had made her employees feel small, overlooked, and undervalued for far too long. Margaret's reign of toxic leadership needed to come to an end. Evelyn's footsteps were deliberate as she made her way to the operations department. Margaret was already at her desk, as usual, barking orders at anyone who came too close, her sharp voice echoing through the open office space. Evelyn stood at the door for a moment, steeling herself. She had a plan, but it was still hard to ignore the rising tide of anger in her chest. The people who had been hurt by Margaret's leadership, they deserved better. And Evelyn was about to give them that. "Margaret, we need to talk." Evelyn's voice was calm, but there was no mistaking the authority behind it. Margaret looked up, clearly irritated at the interruption. "What is it, Evelyn? I'm very busy." Her tone dripped with disdain, as if she had better things to do than speak to someone like Evelyn. "We need to talk privately." Evelyn's voice didn't waver and she didn't move from the doorway. She wasn't asking for permission. Margaret narrowed her eyes and sighed. "Fine. Come in, but make it quick." She stood and walked toward the back of her office, clearly annoyed by the sudden disruption to her day. Evelyn followed her, the weight of what she was about to do pressing on her shoulders. Once they were inside, Margaret sat behind her desk and crossed her arms, clearly expecting Evelyn to be the one to speak first. Evelyn didn't give her that satisfaction. "I've been watching you, Margaret." Evelyn's voice was calm but cutting. "And I've seen how you treat people. I've seen how you treat James, Isabella, and others in this department." She paused, allowing the words to hang in the air. Margaret's expression faltered for a moment, but then she recovered, a smug smile creeping across her face. "I don't know what you're talking about." Margaret's tone was defensive, but Evelyn could hear the hint of guilt behind her words. "I've been running this department for years. People are here to work, not to sit around and talk all day. You've been running this department by degrading your employees, marginalizing them, and letting discrimination run rampant under your watch. Evelyn's words were sharp now, like a blade cutting through the lies. You've let racism and favoritism thrive in this department. James has been here for over 20 years, and yet you treat him like he's expendable. Isabella is constantly ignored, her voice silenced in every meeting. And don't even get me started on Greg, who has barely been here a year but is already getting opportunities that others like James can only dream of. Margaret's face reddened, her hands clenched into fists on her desk. You don't understand. It's not that simple. She spat the words out defensively, her voice cracking slightly. No, Margaret, I do understand. Evelyn's eyes bored into her, and her voice dropped an octave, becoming cold and unforgiving. And it's simple enough for me. What you've been doing here is unacceptable. What you've allowed to happen under your leadership is unacceptable. You've poisoned this department, and it's time for you to go. Margaret's face twisted in anger as she stood up from her desk. You can't do this. I've been with this company for years. You can't just come in here and fire me on your first day. Her voice grew louder, incredulous at the very idea of being removed. I've worked too hard, built this department from the ground up. You don't know anything about what I've been through. Evelyn stood tall, unwavering. I know exactly what I'm doing. She took a step forward, her presence demanding respect. I'm the new CEO of this company. I came here to observe, and I've seen everything I need to see. You're fired, Margaret. Margaret's eyes widened in disbelief. For a moment, she looked like she might argue, but then her gaze flicked toward the door where two security guards were standing, having entered silently at Evelyn's request. You can't do this. Margaret's voice was frantic now, her composure unraveling. This is unfair. I've been set up. You're making a huge mistake. The only mistake I made, Margaret, was waiting this long to act. Evelyn stepped aside as the security guards moved forward, their presence a clear signal that Margaret's time at Sterling Enterprises had come to an end. No one is above the law, Margaret, not even you. Evelyn said firmly, her voice cutting through the room like steel. Now, please leave. Margaret's face twisted in rage and humiliation as she was escorted out of the office. The door slammed shut behind her, and for a moment there was nothing but silence. Then, from the open doorway, a slow, cautious applause began. It started with James, who had been standing just outside the door, watching the entire confrontation. His hands shook slightly as he clapped, but there was a look of relief and gratitude in his eyes. One by one, more employees joined in. Isabella, who had been standing nearby, nodded in silent approval. Slowly, the entire department was clapping, the sound of their applause building with each passing second. The morale in the office began to shift from fear and resignation to hope and determination. Evelyn stood there for a moment, letting the applause wash over her. She had done what needed to be done, but this was just the beginning. There was still much to be done, but the first step had been taken. The toxic reign of Margaret Reynolds had come to an end, and with it, a new chapter for Sterling Enterprises had begun. Evelyn smiled, her heart swelling with a sense of pride and relief. Change had come, and there was no turning back now. The air in the office was thick with anticipation as Evelyn stood before the employees of Sterling Enterprises. It had been an intense few days, and the events of the past week had left everyone in the department on edge. The firing of Margaret Reynolds, the long-standing department manager, had been a shocking moment, one that reverberated through the entire company. But now, the dust had begun to settle, and it was time for Evelyn to take the next critical step, to ensure that the changes she had started would be lasting and real. The moment Evelyn had been waiting for had finally arrived. she was about to address the entire company. The morale shift in the office had been palpable. With Margaret's departure, there was an air of both relief and uncertainty. Some employees were relieved that the toxic atmosphere was finally gone, while others, particularly those who had been aligned with Margaret, were unsure about what the future would hold. Evelyn knew that this moment was critical. She needed to make it clear that the days of discrimination, favoritism, and toxic behavior were over. As Evelyn entered the main conference room, she took a deep breath and made her way to the front. The room quieted instantly, the hum of conversation dying down as everyone turned their attention to her. She could feel their eyes on her, each person wondering what she would do next. This was no longer about just one manager. It was about changing the culture of the entire company. Evelyn was about to set the tone for the future of Sterling Enterprises. She looked around the room, making eye contact with several employees who had been victims of the toxic culture. James Carter, the dedicated employee who had been ignored for so long, stood near the back of the room. Isabella Ramirez, the receptionist who had been silenced for years, sat at one of the front tables, her posture straight and her eyes focused. Evelyn smiled inwardly, knowing that this was the moment she would officially begin to rewrite the rules for everyone at Sterling Enterprises. "Good morning, everyone." Evelyn's voice echoed in the large room, calm but commanding. "As many of you know, this has been a week of significant change for us all. The firing of Margaret Reynolds was just the beginning, but now it's time to ensure that these changes are permanent, and that they are positive, inclusive, and fair for everyone." She paused, letting her words sink in. "I came to Sterling Enterprises to lead a company that values hard work, talent, and most importantly, equality. But what I've discovered is that we have allowed a toxic culture to thrive for far too long. We have allowed favoritism and discrimination to shape the way we treat each other. This ends today." Evelyn's voice grew stronger, more resolute. "From now on, promotions at this company will be based on merit, not favoritism. Every employee here will have an equal opportunity to succeed, regardless of race, gender, or background. No one will be overlooked or pushed aside because of who they are. I will not stand for anything less." A murmur of approval rippled through the room. The employees who had been silently waiting for change seemed to breathe a little easier. Evelyn knew that her words weren't just a promise. They were a declaration. The employees needed to hear that things were going to be different, and she intended to make sure that happened. "We cannot change the past, but we can shape the future." Evelyn continued, locking eyes with James Carter, who stood at the back of the room. "I know that many of you, like James, have worked here for years, putting in the effort and dedication, only to be sidelined by an unfair system. That will change." James's expression softened at the mention of his name. Evelyn's gaze was warm but firm, as if she was personally offering him a future he had long been denied. She then turned her attention to Isabella, who had been silently watching Evelyn's every word. "Isabella, I know you've faced obstacles here that others cannot imagine. Your ideas were never given the chance to be heard, and you were often dismissed because of who you are. That is unacceptable. From now on, your voice will be valued and your contributions will be recognized." Isabella's eyes widened with surprise, and for the first time since Evelyn had entered the room, a small smile played on her lips. The sense of validation was palpable, and it was clear that these words meant more to her than anyone could imagine. "James, I want to officially promote you to a senior position within this company. You've earned it, and it's long overdue." Evelyn's voice was full of pride as she addressed James directly. He looked stunned, unable to hide his emotion. James had spent decades at Sterling Enterprises, and this recognition was the culmination of years of dedication. It was a moment of redemption, one that Evelyn knew was far too late, but would be life-changing for him nonetheless. "Isabella, I am promoting you to oversee a more significant role within our operations. You will be taking on leadership responsibilities and managing key projects. Your ideas matter here, and I'm going to ensure that you are heard." Both James and Isabella stood frozen for a moment, their faces a mixture of shock and gratitude. Evelyn could see their eyes glisten with the recognition they had long been denied. This was more than just a promotion. It was the start of something bigger, a chance for them to shine and prove their worth, not just to the company but to themselves. "I know some of you may have been aligned with Margaret, and I want to be clear. I'm giving you a choice." Evelyn's tone shifted to one that was firm but fair. "If you are willing to change your ways and embrace a new culture of fairness, equality, and hard work, I welcome you to stay and be a part of this transformation. However, if you cannot commit to these values, then this company is no longer the place for you." She let her words hang in the air, allowing everyone to take in the full weight of her declaration. "We will also be implementing new hiring and training programs to prevent the toxic culture from ever creeping back into this company." Evelyn continued, "We will hire based on talent and potential, not on who someone knows or where they come from. We will also provide training to ensure that everyone here understands how to work in a diverse and respectful environment. This will be a company where all voices are heard and all contributions are valued." The room was silent for a moment as the employees absorbed the enormity of what Evelyn had just said. Then, slowly, a wave of applause began to ripple through the room. James was the first to start clapping, followed by Isabella. The rest of the employees soon joined in, and the sound of their applause was like a weight lifting from their shoulders. Evelyn stood still, allowing the moment to unfold. The shift was happening, but there was still much work to be done. This was just the beginning. The employees now knew that Sterling Enterprises was no longer a place where favoritism ruled, where people were left behind because of their background or appearance. It was now a place where hard work and integrity would be the true measure of success. As the applause died down, Evelyn smiled. This was her company now, and she was ready to lead it into a new era, one where every employee could succeed, regardless of who they were or where they came from. The culture at Sterling Enterprises was changing, and with that change came hope, opportunity, and the promise of a better future for everyone. The first few weeks after the restructuring were full of change and anticipation. The new hires were coming in, the training programs were being rolled out, and there was a renewed sense of hope in the air. But as with all significant changes, it wasn't without its challenges. Some employees couldn't, or wouldn't, adapt to the new culture. The company's toxic past had left deep scars, and for some, those scars were too difficult to overcome. Evelyn knew that not everyone would be able to adjust to the new values of Sterling Enterprises. It didn't take long for the first few resignations to roll in. The employees who had been aligned with Margaret Reynolds, the ones who had thrived under the old, unfair system, decided that the new direction wasn't for them. They couldn't reconcile themselves to the idea of working in a company where favoritism and discrimination weren't tolerated. They didn't see the need for accountability, and they didn't want to work in an environment where everyone had an equal chance to succeed. At first, Evelyn felt a twinge of disappointment. She had hoped that more people would embrace the new culture, that they would rise to the occasion and evolve with the company. But she quickly realized that sometimes, change isn't just about the company, it's also about the individuals within it. If they weren't willing to grow, then Sterling Enterprises wasn't the right fit for them. She couldn't afford to let the old ways creep back in, not when they had worked so hard to create something better. In the wake of the departures, there was a noticeable shift in the atmosphere of the office. The employees who stayed were the ones who truly believed in the new direction. They were committed to the idea of fairness and merit, and they wanted to see Sterling Enterprises succeed. There was a renewed sense of teamwork and cooperation among those who had stayed behind. They weren't just employees anymore. They were a part of something larger, something important. James Carter had always been at the heart of the company, even if the company had failed to recognize that for far too long. He had been with Sterling Enterprises for over 20 years, and in that time, he had witnessed the rise and fall of many colleagues. He had seen people promoted for the wrong reasons and others, like himself, left in the shadows despite their hard work. But now, everything had changed. When Evelyn had promoted him to a senior leadership position, it wasn't just a reward for his hard work. It was a recognition of the value he brought to the company. And James had quickly proved himself to be a leader in every sense of the word. He helped to mentor younger employees, and he was instrumental in creating a new culture of inclusivity. He was finally able to use his voice, and it was one that commanded respect. One afternoon, after a particularly long meeting about the company's growth and new initiatives, James approached Evelyn's office. He knocked gently before entering, his expression soft but filled with emotion. Evelyn looked up from her desk, smiling as she saw him standing there. "Hey, James, what's up?" She greeted him warmly, motioning for him to take a seat. James hesitated for a moment before sitting down, clearly a little nervous. But as he looked at Evelyn, a look of gratitude crossed his face. "I just wanted to say thank you, Evelyn." His voice was thick with emotion. "I don't know if you'll ever really understand how much this means to me. When you promoted me, I thought it was a mistake. I thought maybe you were just doing it to make a point, or because you felt sorry for me. But now," he paused, his voice trailing off as he searched for the right words. "Now, I wake up every day looking forward to coming to work. I feel like I matter again, like my work has meaning." Evelyn felt a lump form in her throat as she listened to him. She had known that promoting him was the right thing to do, but hearing it from him, seeing how much it had impacted his life, it was more than she could have ever hoped for. She had never wanted to just be a CEO who gave lip service to change. She wanted to be someone who made a real difference, someone who helped people like James find the recognition and respect they deserved. "You earned it, James," Evelyn said firmly, her voice filled with sincerity. "You've put in the work, and now it's your time. You're making an impact here. We're all making an impact." James smiled, the weight of years of frustration lifting off his shoulders. "I never thought I'd see the day when Sterling Enterprises would be a place where people like me could succeed. It's been a long road, but I'm glad I stuck it out." Evelyn nodded. "I'm glad you did too, James. We're just getting started." She stood up and walked around her desk to stand beside him. For a moment, the office was silent, the air heavy with the significance of the conversation. James had found his place in the company, and Evelyn had found the satisfaction of knowing she had helped him get there. "We're going to keep building this company, James. We're going to build it into a place where everyone can succeed, where people like you and Isabella, who have put in so much work, are finally recognized for the value they bring. And we're going to keep pushing forward until everyone at this company feels like they're part of something bigger." James smiled, his eyes filled with gratitude. "And I'll be right here, helping you make it happen." Evelyn smiled back, feeling the weight of her words sink in. The work wasn't over. There was still so much to do, but for the first time in a long time, she felt like they were moving in the right direction. Sterling Enterprises wasn't just a company anymore. It was a community of people working together for a common purpose. And Evelyn was proud of the path they were on. As the days turned into weeks and then months, the changes that Evelyn had set in motion became a new reality for everyone at Sterling Enterprises. The company became known not just for its success in the market, but for its commitment to fairness, diversity, and inclusion. The toxic culture of the past was slowly but surely eradicated, replaced by a culture where hard work, dedication, and mutual respect were the true measures of success. By the end of the year, Evelyn stood at the front of the company's annual meeting, looking out over the faces of the employees who had stuck with her. They were thriving. The company was thriving. And as she spoke to the room, one thing was clear: this was only the beginning. The truth is, real change takes action. Evelyn said, her voice strong and confident. It's not enough to just talk about it. You have to live it. You have to be willing to make the hard decisions, to do the work. And that's what we've done here. This is just the start, and together, we'll continue to make Sterling Enterprises a place where everyone can be proud to work. The room erupted in applause, and Evelyn couldn't help but smile. The change had come, and it was real.